A lively circus performance turned into a raging inferno in less than 10 minutes. A simple self-portrait became, by chance, a one-way ticket to death. A theater once proudly advertised as fireproof transformed into a mass grave for hundreds of spectators. Today, we will revisit these disasters of the past. But before you settle in, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss the stories still to come. Story 1. The Hartford Circus Fire. On the 6th of July, 1944, the circus arrived in Hartford, Connecticut. Residents poured eagerly into the massive Big Top to witness a performance unlike anything of its day. Trained lions and tigers, breathtaking acrobatics, a miniature menagerie filled with exotic creatures, and a sequence of dazzling circus acts. Around 7,000 spectators took their seats beneath the giant canvas tent. But before that afternoon's show could draw to a close, one of the deadliest temporary building fires in American history would erupt. In the 1940s, the circus was a very different spectacle than it is today. The Ringling Brothers were among the largest and most celebrated troupes in the nation, traveling the length and breadth of the United States by train, setting up for several days at a time near major population centers. Their Big Top was, at that time, one of the largest in the world, capable of seating some 9,000 people around 3 parallel rings. For many residents, its arrival was a rare occasion for enjoyment. The Second World War had dragged on for years, leaving few opportunities for leisure. With most men serving overseas, the audience that day consisted largely of women and children. The circus itself bore the scars of war. Resources were scarce, and transport was often disrupted by the priority given to munitions and supplies. In fact, the Ringling Brothers had planned to arrive in Hartford and erect their tent by the afternoon of July 5th for the grand opening. But delays in transportation forced them to cancel the first show, a misfortune that many circus folk regarded as a bad omen. They surely breathed a sigh of relief when the evening performance on July 5th passed without incident. Yet disaster was only waiting until the following day. July 6th dawned oppressively hot. Nevertheless, more than 7,000 spectators crowded in. The throng funneled through the few main entrances and filled the wooden bleachers surrounding the rings. Then, without warning, flames appeared. To this day, no one knows with certainty how the blaze began. It may have been deliberate arson, or simply a dropped match or cigarette. Whatever the cause, the fire broke out on the southern side of the tent shortly after the performance began. Ushers rushed with buckets of water in a futile attempt to extinguish it, but the flames quickly raced upward from the ground to the canvas roof. Once they reached the top, they erupted with terrible force and spread at frightening speed. Many survivors later described the rapid advance of the flames as resembling an explosion. While the exact cause of the initial ignition remains unknown, the reason for the fire's horrifying spread was tragically clear. The tent had been fashioned from 2 types of canvas. The sidewalls were made of plain, untreated fabric with no fire resistance whatsoever. The roof had been waterproofed by soaking the canvas in a mixture of paraffin and gasoline, a method considered standard practice at the time. Fire was not an unfamiliar threat. In fact, the circus had endured blazes on several occasions before, though none had ever claimed human life. Just 2 years earlier, a terrible fire had destroyed nearly all of their animal menagerie, and on another occasion the entire Big Top had burned to the ground, miraculously without a single casualty. Circus staff were well aware of the ever-present risk. To mitigate it, so-called seat men were stationed beneath the bleachers with large buckets of water kept close at hand. When a stray match or cigarette ignited the canvas sidewall, they would rush to stamp it out. Yet, in hindsight, this precaution was woefully inadequate. At first, when the flames clung to the sidewall, evacuation remained relatively calm. The circus band struck up Stars and Stripes Forever, the prearranged emergency song, both to soothe the audience and to alert all staff that something was wrong. Ushers quickly guided people toward the exits. With 7,000 spectators, the situation seemed manageable, until the fire surged into the roof and tore across the paraffin-soaked canvas like a massive fireball. Those still inside suddenly found themselves trapped beneath a burning canopy that threatened to collapse at any moment. One might think escaping a circus tent would be simple, and indeed many survived by crawling beneath the canvas. But not everyone had that chance. Those seated high in the bleachers were forced to leap down before finding a way out. The main exits became hopelessly clogged. There were only a handful of proper exits, while others were blocked by the large iron chutes used to usher animals into the ring. Within minutes, these cages would have been removed, but the fire spread too quickly. Many spectators had no choice but to scramble over the barriers in a desperate bid for survival. Elsewhere, unsecured wooden benches collapsed into chaos, tripping those attempting to flee. As the blaze widened and burned through the guy ropes, support poles began to topple. In only a few short minutes, the entire roof gave way, burying anyone left inside. From the first spark until complete destruction, less than 10 minutes had passed. By the time fire engines roared to the scene, it was already far too late. The official death toll stood at 168, including a single record that covered unidentified partial remains. 3 more victims succumbed to their injuries in the following months, while countless survivors bore both physical scars and lasting trauma for the rest of their lives. Even in wartime, the Hartford Circus Fire was a shocking disaster. Its victims were ordinary people, many of them children, seeking only a rare moment of joy in a harsh era. The performing animals, a vital part of the circus, mostly survived. The lions had just been led from the stage when the fire broke out, escaping with only minor burns. Had the flames erupted only minutes earlier, the panic of wild animals would surely have worsened the chaos and added to the already grim toll. Still, camels, zebras, and elephants had to be led into the surrounding streets to keep them from bolting as fire crews poured into the grounds. Naturally, an investigation followed. Hartford itself had not been negligent. The city had recently invested heavily in new fire escapes, but the circus had slipped through the cracks. Never before had there been a serious fire in such a setting, and no detailed plan for response existed. Inspectors had checked the tent for structural soundness, but not for flammability or fire safety. The cause of the blaze was never officially determined. Some circus folk insisted it was arson, while others pointed to a sparking spotlight. Yet multiple inquiries concluded that the most likely culprit was a dropped match or cigarette. Several circus officials were charged with involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to as many as 5 years in prison, though all were released early for good behavior or health concerns. The circus itself, though it never accepted legal liability, sought to make amends. For nearly 10 years, it voluntarily set aside all profits so Hartford could distribute compensation to the victims for their losses and suffering. When the troupe eventually resumed its tours, significant changes were made. Local authorities across the country now demanded proof that big tops were fireproof, and smoking bans, once ignored, were strictly enforced. Fire inspectors began conducting routine checks, even in places where none had previously been required. Though terrible, the fire forced the nation to confront the reality that such a calamity could occur and to take measures to prevent its recurrence. On the 50th anniversary of the blaze, a permanent memorial was dedicated. A metal plaque marks the center of the old ring, while a circle of trees outlines the footprint of the tent. With today's fire safety standards, it is believed that, at least in the United States, this will remain the last memorial ever needed for victims of a circus fire. Story 2. The Iroquois Theater Disaster. On the 30th of December, 1903, a fire broke out on the stage of the newly built Iroquois Theater in Chicago, Illinois. The theater's advertisements had boldly proclaimed the building to be entirely fireproof, but the reality proved tragically otherwise. The very design of the structure set the stage for a death toll greater than that of any other single-building fire in American history, and it would force sweeping changes in safety standards for public assembly spaces, the regulations that remain in place to this day. The Iroquois Theater had been completed only weeks earlier, officially opening its doors on the 23rd of November, 1903. It was hailed as a grand masterpiece, adorned with marble staircases, soaring ceilings, and polished wood paneling that gleamed under the gaslights. Yet despite its opulence, the building was far from safe. Even by the already lax fire codes of the era, the Iroquois fell short. Strikes among construction workers had delayed progress, and in the rush to meet the promised opening date, corners were cut. Essential safety features were left out, with vague assurances that they would be installed later, among them fire alarms and an automatic sprinkler system. Worse still, in the name of architectural elegance, the designer chose to omit illuminated exit signs altogether. The theater seated its audience across 3 levels, with a tiered ticketing system. The cheapest seats were perched high above the stage, accessible only by narrow, twisting stairways. Those with more means could ascend the broad marble staircase from the lobby to the balcony, while the most expensive tickets brought patrons to the ground floor, close to the performers. To prevent those in the cheaper seats from sneaking down to better ones, iron gates were installed between the levels and kept locked during the performance. On the fateful afternoon of December 30th, however, This measure hardly mattered. The theater was packed beyond capacity. Not a single seat left vacant. Though the official capacity was roughly 1,600, that day more than 2,000 people crammed inside. The crowd overflowed into aisles, blocking exits and escape routes. The performance on stage was Mr. Bluebeard, a light-hearted family musical based on a French fairy tale. School holidays had begun, and so the audience was filled largely with mothers and children. At about 3:15 in the afternoon, as the lights dimmed for a nighttime scene, a stage lamp swung across and brushed the upper portion of a curtain. A small flame flickered to life, visible to the audience, but most assumed it was merely part of the show. Backstage, however, panic erupted. Theater employees scrambled desperately to put out the blaze. Their only tools were a few canisters of household fire suppressant powder, meant for hearths. The powder sifted down like useless dust. When they tried striking at the flames with poles, they only scattered burning fragments further across the set. The stage manager ordered the asbestos fire curtain lowered, hoping to shield the audience and buy time for an evacuation. But the curtain snagged on a lighting reflector and stuck partway down. The flames leapt to the ceiling, igniting painted backdrops made of oiled canvas, an incredibly flammable material, and in moments, the blaze roared out of control. Thick, choking smoke billowed into the auditorium, and panic began to spread through the crowd. At that moment, comedian Eddie Foy, whose young son was seated among the audience, immediately ordered stagehands to escort the boy to safety, while he himself rushed onto the stage. As burning fragments of scenery rained down around him, Foy called for calm, urging spectators not to panic. He instructed the orchestra to continue playing in an effort to steady the crowd, and reminded them of the theater's much-touted claim of being absolutely fireproof. But within moments, a blazing backdrop collapsed onto the stage, sending actors fleeing in terror, some of them already alight as they ran. The audience surged toward the exits, only to find many doors locked fast. In the upper galleries, escape routes were sealed off by iron gates. Confused patrons mistook decorative windows for emergency exits and hurled themselves against them in vain. Others poured out onto fire escapes that proved far too narrow, and in some cases not yet completed. Dozens fell to the ground below, many killed instantly, while those who fell later were spared only because the bodies of earlier victims broke their fall. Witnessing the chaos, some chose to remain seated rather than risk being crushed in the stampede. Yet only minutes later, the flames on stage had spread into a full inferno. When other doors within the theater were finally opened, the sudden rush of air fed the blaze, and a fireball swept across the auditorium, devouring everything in its path. There was no working fire alarm, no emergency telephone. Firefighters were alerted only when an employee ran into the street to activate a firebox. By the time help arrived, the disaster was already beyond control. Even so, a handful of spectators escaped through sheer chance. Outside, passers-by became unlikely rescuers. A railroad worker happened by with his tools. He quickly dismantled door hinges and freed dozens trapped inside. Elsewhere, construction workers scrambled onto scaffolding and threw planks across to incomplete fire escapes, enabling some to crawl to safety. Their efforts saved lives, but could do little against the overwhelming toll. In all, 602 people perished in the blaze, with many more dying from injuries in the aftermath. The horror dominated newspaper headlines for months, amplified by revelations that the so-called asbestos fire curtain had in fact been made of wood pulp, and would have been useless even if it had lowered properly. The theater had never held a fire drill. Reports accused fire inspectors of accepting free tickets in exchange for ignoring glaring hazards. Though official inquiries placed the blame squarely on the theater's owners, not a single one faced criminal punishment. Lawsuits dragged on for years, only to collapse one by one. Yet public outrage, combined with a genuine fear of repetition, spurred sweeping reforms. Overselling tickets beyond legal capacity was outlawed. The tragedy also marked the widespread adoption of outward-swinging emergency doors equipped with push-bar latches, a device invented years earlier after Britain's Victoria Hall disaster, but never widely used in America until Iroquois burned. Eddie Foy, who escaped with his son, was celebrated as a hero. Even though his pleas for calm could not quell the chaos, he went on to enjoy a long and successful career in the theater. The Iroquois itself was reduced to a charred shell. Rebuilt and reopened as the Colonial Theater, it operated without incident until 1925, when it was demolished and replaced by the Oriental Theater. Story 3. A Brief History of Death by Selfie. On the 19th of August, 1839, a new technology was unveiled to the world during a presentation at the French Academy of Sciences. The scientist Dominique François Arago announced the daguerreotype, a revolutionary method that could capture vivid images with a clarity far beyond anything previously known. Just a few months later, an American photographer used the invention to take a picture of himself, the earliest recorded example of what we now call a selfie. In the early years of photography, when the process was still being refined by numerous inventors, photographs of people remained rare. The exposure times were simply too long, making the method better suited for static objects, though a few images managed to capture faint human figures. By the turn of the new century, photography had advanced considerably. Around the 1900s, an anonymous woman took her own picture using a mirror, likely the very first example of a mirror selfie. That photograph still survives today, though almost nothing is known about her. As cameras became cheaper and more accessible, photographs grew into an everyday part of life, and self-portraits steadily gained popularity. The true leap came in the early 2000s, when mobile phones began to incorporate cameras. By 2003, the first front-facing cameras appeared, allowing users to frame themselves with ease and making the practice of self-photography more convenient than ever. By 2002, the word selfie had already begun to enter common use. The first recorded instance appeared that same year on an internet forum. A man named Nathan Hope posted about a split stitch after a drunken fall. He attached a photo of himself and added, "I had a gash on my lower lip, about 1 centimeter long. Sorry about the poor focus." It was a selfie. Little more than a decade later, in 2013, the term had become so widespread that it was formally added to the Oxford English Dictionary. By then, with the explosion of social media, people were eagerly sharing unique and striking selfies for the world to see. Yet from that point onward, accidents linked to selfies began to mount. One of the first fatal cases occurred on the 31st of May, 2014. Shortly after midnight, Amritpal Singh, a 29-year-old amateur pilot, took off in a 2-seat Cessna 150 from Front Range Airport in Adams County, Colorado. With him was Jatinder Singh, a 31-year-old musician in town for a performance, whom Amritpal had invited for a sightseeing flight. Moments after takeoff, Amritpal lost control. The aircraft banked, then plummeted into a nearby field, remaining undiscovered for nearly 6 hours. When authorities arrived, both men were already dead from their injuries. The investigation centered on a GoPro camera and a mobile phone recovered from the wreckage. Footage from earlier flights revealed that Amritpal had repeatedly flown while taking selfies, even using a flash during night flights. Although no recordings survived from the fatal flight, investigators could find no other explanation for why Amritpal, who had logged more than 700 flight hours and was considered proficient in handling emergencies, had suddenly lost control. The final conclusion was that he had likely been distracted by the act of taking photos, losing both his orientation and altitude in the process. On the 9th of August, 2015, David Lopez and his friends traveled to the town of Vilaseca, one of many places in Spain that host the annual running of the bulls. The event typically involves participants dashing through narrow streets with enraged animals charging close behind, many of the bulls deliberately provoked before being released to heighten the spectacle. David and his companions chose not to take part, watching instead from behind the barriers. By the end of the day, however, David noticed one bull staggered and dazed after a collision. He slipped past the protective fencing to approach the animal and take a photograph with it. In that moment, another bull charged unexpectedly and gored him with tremendous force. David was rushed to emergency care but did not survive. Accidents at bull running festivals are far from rare, yet this case stood out as one of the few in which a spectator was killed rather than a participant. On the 9th of October, 2015, Belgian tourist Françoise Goma and her husband visited the famed El Tachio geyser field in Chile's Andes Mountains. This geothermal basin, the third largest in the world, boasts countless hot springs and violently active mineral geysers. Its surreal landscape, otherworldly in appearance, draws travelers from across the globe. But like most geothermal zones, El Tachio hides grave dangers. Some pools can reach 85 degrees Celsius, or 185 degrees Fahrenheit, their surfaces covered only by thin, brittle crusts that can crack underfoot. Françoise hoped to capture a selfie with one particularly striking geyser. She stepped close, turned her back to the steaming column, and lifted her phone to take the picture. Suddenly, the geyser erupted with violent force. Startled, she stumbled backward, straight into a pool near 100 degrees Celsius. Her husband pulled her out at once, but by then her body had suffered catastrophic burns. Though a rescue helicopter rushed her to hospital, Françoise succumbed to her injuries in the early hours of the following morning. On the 8th of November 2017, 26-year-old Wu Yongning climbed the Huaiyuan International Center in Changsha, China. He reached the summit and then pressed higher still, scaling another 20 stories on the outside of the structure until he hung some 62 floors above the ground. Wu was there to film himself performing dangerous stunts on the very edges of the skyscraper. For years, he had been known for such feats. Not only did they thrill him, they also provided a steady income. His jaw-dropping images, dangling from ledges, stretching out over dizzying drops, had drawn tens of thousands of followers on social media and even secured sponsorship deals. This climb, Wu hoped, would earn him 100,000 yuan, about $15,000, in a photography competition. He needed the money desperately. The next day, he planned to propose to his girlfriend, pay for their wedding, and cover costly medical care for his ailing mother. Once at the chosen height, he set up his camera and attempted a familiar stunt, suspending himself from the edge of the building and completing several push-ups in mid-air. He had done this many times before. That day, though he managed the maneuver, the effort drained him. When he tried to pull himself back up, his strength gave out. Wu fell. His body was later discovered by a window cleaner, resting on a ledge 45 floors below. A month afterward, his girlfriend confirmed his death publicly, leaving tens of thousands of fans in mourning. In both cases, the desire to capture a single striking image cost them their lives. By some estimates, worldwide more than one person per week dies in selfie-related accidents, a tragic legacy the pioneers of self-portrait photography, more than a century ago, could never have imagined. The tragedies in today's video serve as a reminder that just a single fleeting moment can forever alter the fate of hundreds of lives. If you found these stories compelling, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the journeys still to come. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear from you.